December 1944. In the middle of a Kansas night, the wind hummed against the wire. Beyond the perimeter lights, the prairie stretched empty and endless. Inside the camp, a few hundred German prisoners stood frozen in place, not from cold, but from confusion. From somewhere near the recreation hall came a sound they had never heard in war. A trumpet sliding into a blues note, a drummer tapping steady on a snare, laughter spilling out between beats. It was American swing, Benny Goodman's rhythm, the pulse of a world their Reich had called degenerate. The prisoners stared, some curious, others unsettled. Inside, U.S. soldiers and local girls crowded beneath paper garlands. The sign above the stage read, USO Dance Tonight, Entertainment for Our Boys. The air smelled of cigarettes, coffee, and sawdust. The band leader counted off again, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the walls shook with applause. Behind the barbed wire, a few German voices murmured disbelief. One whispered, "So this is how they fight despair." It was the sound of America, rhythm, freedom, and something the prisoners could neither name nor dismiss. To understand that night, we must go back to how they got there, across oceans, through defeat, and into the strange mercy of captivity. By the winter of 1944, the Third Reich was collapsing, and the United States, though far from Europe's front lines, had become its most unexpected jailer. Across the American heartland, from Texas to Iowa to Georgia, new barbed wire cities rose overnight. Each one housed men who had once sworn allegiance to Adolf Hitler. By the end of the war, more than 425,000 German prisoners of war would live behind American fences, guarded not by vengeance, but by policy. The first groups arrived in 1943, captured during the North African campaign. They were veterans of Rommel's Africa Corps, sunburned, exhausted, and bewildered to find themselves on ships bound not for Britain or Egypt, but across the Atlantic. The United States had the space, the food, and the resources to hold them, and under the 1929 Geneva Convention, it had the duty to do so humanely. For many of these men, the voyage felt surreal. They had grown up under Nazi propaganda that painted America as decadent and chaotic, a land of jazz, crime, and racial mixing. When they stepped off the trains in places like Camp Hearn, Texas, or Camp Aliceville, Alabama, the reality was stranger than the lie. Wide skies, friendly locals, and the smell of bread baking from nearby towns, it was a captivity that looked nothing like punishment. The American system of captivity. United States approached the problem of prisoners of war with characteristic bureaucracy and optimism. In 1943, the War Department established the Provost Marshal General's Office Prisoner of War Division. It oversaw hundreds of camps spread across 46 states. Each camp followed Geneva regulations strictly: housing, medical care, food rations equivalent to those of American troops, and, perhaps most astonishingly, recreation. The idea was pragmatic. A content prisoner was easier to control than a bitter one. Morale, not misery, kept camps stable. The U.S. government saw humane treatment not as charity, but as strategy, a reflection of democratic values meant to contrast Nazi brutality. Each camp included a canteen, a hospital, and, if possible, a recreation hall. The halls were multi-purpose, lecture spaces by day, movie theaters by night, and sometimes dance floors on weekends. Under the watch of the War Prisoners' Aid of the YMCA, the camps also received musical instruments, sports equipment, and library books. The Geneva Convention required access to cultural activities, and the U.S. honored that obligation meticulously. By 1944, the YMCA's prisoner service had distributed over 5,000 violins, 2,000 accordions, hundreds of brass instruments, and tens of thousands of books across the POW system. It was a gesture both moral and political, the hope that through exposure to American culture, even an enemy might learn civility. From the battlefield to the Midwest for the prisoners, life inside an American camp was a strange mixture of relief and humiliation. Many had fought on deserts or in snowfields. Now they woke to the sound of roosters and the smell of cornfields. Most worked, by choice, on local farms or lumber projects, earning a small wage credited to their camp accounts. Their presence filled the labor gap left by millions of American men overseas. Local civilians were often startled at how ordinary their enemy looked. Farmers wrote in diaries that the Germans were polite, disciplined, even grateful for food and rest. Some locals invited them for coffee under guard supervision. Despite the risk of fraternization, curiosity worked both ways. For many Germans, this was their first encounter with ordinary Americans, not soldiers but citizens. Behind the wire, discipline remained strict, but not brutal. Guards were often young Americans barely older than the prisoners themselves. Many had never seen combat. To maintain order, the U.S. military relied less on punishment and more on procedure, daily roll calls, inspections, and a rigid schedule. Yet within that framework, the men were free to organize their own lives, schools, newspapers, and music. The sound of America music, more than any lecture or leaflet, became the heart of the American re-education experiment. To many Germans, jazz was the sound of the enemy, banned under Hitler as degenerate and racially impure. But in America, it was everywhere. The rhythm escaped through camp radios, truck radios, and nearby dance halls. By 1944, the United Service Organizations, USO, had become a cultural army of its own. Its mission was to entertain and sustain American troops. Over the course of the war, it sponsored more than 420,000 live shows, reaching an audience of 130 million soldiers across the world. Bob Hope, Bing Crosby, Lena Horne, and the Andrews sisters carried laughter into barracks, hospitals, and airfields. Sometimes those same performances could be heard from outside the fences. In camps located near U.S. Army bases, POWs listened as swing bands rehearsed or toured. The rhythm of American freedom came to them in fragments. A trumpet echo, a burst of applause, a distant female voice singing, "Don't sit under the apple tree." At first, the reaction was confusion. Some prisoners mocked the music, others dismissed it as chaos. But for younger men, those who had grown up under Nazi censorship, the sound carried a strange, forbidden energy. They began to mimic it. Using donated instruments, German prisoners formed their own bands. They played marches, folk songs, and eventually cautiously swing. The first time a POW jazz band performed in an American camp was recorded at Camp Concordia, Kansas, in late 1944. The players wore improvised uniforms, their sheet music copied by hand. Their audience was mixed, fellow prisoners, American guards, and local visitors. The applause was genuine. Culture as weapon, the U.S. command recognized that cultural exposure was doing more than filling time. It was reshaping minds. In 1944, the Special Projects Division, SPD, was created to coordinate a broader re-education effort. Under its guidance, POW camps received films, lectures, and reading materials designed to contrast democracy with dictatorship. The SPD's tone was careful. Open propaganda was forbidden under the Geneva Convention, but the Allies understood that culture itself could persuade. Jazz, movies, even the simple ritual of politeness were teaching tools. The goal wasn't conversion, it was reflection. The program's architects, including Army psychologists and German-speaking academics, believed that respect could undermine Nazism more effectively than punishment. They called it reorientation. By treating German prisoners as men capable of thought, they challenged the very obedience that the Nazi system demanded. This approach was radical for its time. The Soviet Union, by contrast, treated German prisoners as slave laborers. Britain often kept them under harsher austerity. The American experiment was different. It sought to prove that democracy could be both firm and humane. The human paradox still, contradictions ran through the wire. Many Americans had lost brothers and sons to German bullets. Some guards resented the comfort their captives received. Newspapers occasionally stirred outrage. Headlines like, "Enemy eating steak while our boys fight," appeared in regional press. But for the War Department, adherence to the Geneva Convention was not negotiable. The treatment of German POWs set a precedent. It was proof to the world that America fought not just for victory, but for principle. And perhaps more quietly, it was a statement about confidence. A nation that could feed and educate its enemies was a nation certain of its own survival. Between wire and dance floor, as 1945 approached, the camps took on a strange dual existence. Inside the fences, prisoners drilled, worked, and played music. Outside, towns celebrated holidays, held bond drives, and danced to Glenn Miller. Sometimes the worlds overlapped. At Camp Aliceville, local citizens attended POW art exhibitions. In Kansas and Texas, American officers invited German musicians to play at Army events. It wasn't fraternization, it was diplomacy in miniature. Jazz, swing, and social dances became informal bridges between two civilizations that had spent years destroying each other. One former prisoner, decades later, recalled the shock of hearing Count Basie's 1 o'clock jump played live at a camp gathering. "We thought America was all factories and machines. Then we heard this music. It was free. It moved where it wanted to go. No order, no salute, and only joy. That joy was disorienting. For men raised in a regime that glorified rigidity, rhythm itself became revelation, setting the stage for transformation. By late 1944, the American system of captivity had become a social experiment unmatched in history. Thousands of miles from Berlin, inside wooden barracks and makeshift halls, a generation of German soldiers was being exposed to a world that functioned without fear. They worked for fair pay. They saw guards obey rules rather than whims. They heard music that ignored hierarchy. Slowly, their view of the enemy and of themselves began to shift. It was within this paradox, a war defined by destruction, producing moments of unexpected humanity, and that the most curious scenes unfolded. Scenes where the uniform of the conqueror stood beside the defeated, both tapping their feet to the same beat. Scenes where the sound of jazz carried through barbed wire and found, on the other side, not defiance but recognition. That sound and that rhythm of America would soon become the turning point in this story, when music, not military power, began to dissolve the invisible walls that the war had built between men. The strange world of the American prisoner of war camps was not defined by violence or escape, but by contrast, the collision of two moral universes contained within one fence line. What unfolded inside those barbed enclosures was not a battle of guns but of ideas, habits, and sound. To understand what that meant, we must look at the story from three perspectives: the prisoners, the guards, and the thin space between them where music became a form of quiet diplomacy. For the German prisoners, captivity in America began as humiliation. The first months were marked by silence and suspicion. They arrived proud, indoctrinated, and weary from campaigns in Africa and Europe. Many carried themselves with the stiffness of men trained to obey, not to question. When they saw the camp bands, the pianos, the radio antennas, they assumed it was all propaganda, a theatrical trap. But the rhythms that seeped through the wire each night, the laughter, the distant horns, began to unsettle them in ways that no lecture could. Inside Camp Hearn in Texas, a group of Africa Corps veterans organized a classical orchestra using instruments sent by the YMCA. They played Beethoven and Wagner, trying to hold on to the sound of home. Yet one afternoon, when the camp's American recreation officer left a phonograph in the hall, a record of Duke Ellington spun into the air. The prisoners froze. The syncopation, loose, effortless, unmilitary, was unlike anything they had ever heard. Some dismissed it as Nager music echoing Nazi propaganda, but others leaned closer as if drawn by curiosity they did not want to admit. The more they listened, the more the strangeness faded. The music was both disciplined and free, an orchestra of equals, each instrument independent yet cooperative. It was the sound of democracy translated into rhythm. For men who had been trained to march in perfect unison, that freedom was incomprehensible, and yet something in it resonated. At Camp Aliceville in Alabama, prisoners formed their own swing group within months. The band began as an experiment, a few volunteers with a borrowed trumpet and accordion. They learned by ear, mimicking what they heard from American radio stations. Before long, they were playing at Sunday gatherings, mixing German folk tunes with bits of jazz. Guards would pause outside the hall, half smiling, half astonished. The enemy, who once followed the drums of the Reich, was now keeping time to American swing. The guards, too, lived through contradictions. Many were young Americans who had never left their home states before the war. They expected hatred and danger, not politeness. Yet most of their prisoners were disciplined and respectful. Some guards found the routine dull, endless inspections, paperwork, and watch shifts that stretched across quiet Midwestern nights. For them, the music was a release. Camp officers were instructed to maintain formality, but within that discipline, there was room for humanity. When the USO rolled through nearby towns with its camp show circuits, guards attended, and sometimes they brought stories, or even spare sheet music, back to their camps. The War Department encouraged morale activities, believing that content guards meant stable prisoners. Music drifted between both worlds, a faint thread of common comfort. One sergeant from Kansas later recalled, "We'd sit in the guard tower and hear those Krauts rehearsing. It was the same rhythm we danced to on leave. For a while you forgot who was who. It was just music. It was not friendship, there was too much loss for that, but it was recognition. Both sides understood discipline. Both understood longing. The USO's touring entertainers also became part of this unlikely equation. While their primary mission was to perform for American soldiers, the sound of their shows often reached the prisoners as well. When a nearby army base hosted a concert, the amplified brass and laughter carried across the open fields into the compounds. POWs would gather by the fences listening. The music of Glenn Miller or Tommy Dorsey, meant for American troops, became an accidental bridge across enemy lines. Between guard and prisoner, between discipline and freedom, there existed a space, physical and emotional, where cultural exchange happened almost invisibly. In that space, the rigid ideologies of war began to loosen. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, one of the largest German POW camps in America, this phenomenon reached its peak. The camp was vast, nearly 4,000 prisoners, 800 buildings, even a theater and art studio. The commandant, Colonel Lawrence Ball, believed in strict order but also in trust. Under his watch, prisoners managed their own orchestra, complete with conductor, uniforms, and printed programs. They performed classical works, but they also experimented, Gershwin, swing arrangements, even American marches. The audiences were mixed, prisoners, guards, sometimes local townspeople invited under supervision. Each performance was a cultural negotiation. The Germans played with precision. The Americans applauded with warmth, and in the applause something unexpected happened: mutual respect. For the German musicians, applause from an enemy carried moral weight. It meant their humanity had survived defeat. For the Americans, listening to their captives play Beethoven and Ellington side by side was proof that civilization had not been lost to war. The newspapers within the camp reflected this slow evolution. Camp newsletters, written in German but approved by American officers, began printing reviews of concerts and essays about American culture. One prisoner wrote, "We believed these people had no art, no soul. Now I hear jazz and understand. It is freedom set to music." But not all prisoners accepted it. Among the ranks were hardcore Nazis who viewed the re-education program and cultural activities as betrayal. They held secret meetings enforcing ideological loyalty, even punishing those who cooperated too openly. In some camps, this caused deep divisions, the so-called black and gray prisoners, the fanatics and the moderates. For many younger men, however, the war's end was already visible on the horizon. They were tired, homesick, and skeptical of the old dogmas. When they heard American music, they felt something beyond politics, a pulse of life unregulated by fear. Some prisoners used their wages to buy phonograph records from local stores through the camp exchange system. Others requested sheet music for American songs. The YMCA's War Prisoners Aid responded by shipping not only instruments, but thousands of American popular scores, the same tunes being played by USO orchestras across the country. Within months, small jazz groups began to appear in camps from Oklahoma to Nebraska. These bands performed at Sunday gatherings, their instruments cobbled together from scrap wood and tin, their trumpets dented from transport. Yet their music carried authenticity, imperfect, rough, but joyous. American officers documented these performances carefully. The Special Projects Division noted that exposure to Western music, films, and literature has yielded spontaneous interest among German prisoners. In bureaucratic language, that meant something profound. Art was succeeding where ideology had failed. The USO's role in this transformation cannot be overstated. Though primarily focused on entertaining U.S. troops, its presence created an atmosphere of sound and emotion that the POWs could not ignore. From the Pacific to the heartland, the organization's slogan, "Keep 'em smiling," symbolized more than morale. It was the projection of American identity. When USO camp shows performed near POW sites, The rhythms reached across fields and wire. Jazz standards, patriotic ballads, and comic sketches echoed faintly in the night. Some prisoners described lying awake, listening through open barracks windows. They couldn't see the performers, but the applause of hundreds of American soldiers painted a picture of a culture that valued laughter, not fear. It was here that the cultural divide began to blur. For German prisoners who had grown up under totalitarian control, the idea of art serving joy rather than propaganda was revolutionary. Music in Nazi Germany had been a tool, a weapon of unity, obedience, and glory. In America, music was personal, improvisational, free to mock itself. Even a simple swing beat carried political meaning. It celebrated imperfection, individuality, and collaboration. In one documented moment from Camp Concordia, a group of German prisoners requested permission to attend a Christmas concert performed by the USO for American troops nearby. The commandant declined, but arranged for the concert to be broadcast over loudspeakers into the compound. As the music played, a mix of hymns, jazz, and sentimental songs, hundreds of prisoners stood quietly in the yard. Some wept. One later wrote in his diary, "They play like men who have no hatred left in them." Perhaps this is what peace sounds like. For the guards, such reactions were deeply humanizing. It reminded them that the men behind the wire were not monsters, but reflections of themselves caught on the wrong side of history. In a war built on dehumanization, this recognition was rare and powerful. Gradually, camp culture began to merge with community life. Local townsfolk were hired to work in kitchens and hospitals. Some attended open-air performances. Children who lived near the camps recalled seeing prisoners playing soccer or rehearsing bands through the fence. For them, the enemy became a familiar sight, hard-working, polite, and oddly civilized. These small interactions would later form the bedrock of post-war reconciliation. The men who had once viewed each other across gun sights were now sharing applause. There was irony in this entire arrangement. The United States, at the peak of its military power, used music and entertainment, symbols of leisure, as tools of control. But in doing so, it revealed something about its confidence as a nation. The jazz bands, the USO shows, the camp dance halls, they were all expressions of an America that believed freedom could survive even in captivity. For the prisoners, that realization came slowly. They were not converted overnight. Many remained loyal to Germany, even to Hitler, until the Reich's final collapse. Yet as weeks turned into months, a subtle erosion of certainty took hold. They began to compare, not just rations and treatment, but values. They saw guards who followed orders without cruelty. They witnessed authority without terror. They listened to music born from diversity, performed without hierarchy. In these small details, they encountered a strength different from the one they had been taught to admire. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, the camps erupted in paradoxical emotion. Some prisoners cheered quietly, grateful that the killing was over. Others mourned the death of their nation. But amidst that confusion, the routines continued. Work details, inspections, and in the evenings, music. The jazz bands played louder now, their rhythms less cautious. Guards sometimes joined in clapping from outside. A few officers even danced unofficially at camp gatherings. It was as if everyone needed rhythm to process what words could not express. In these nights of uncertain peace, the music became more than entertainment. It became language, one without enemies. By the time repatriation began, many prisoners had developed an affection they did not fully understand. They had lived among their conquerors and found them decent. They had mocked their music only to be moved by it. They had entered America as soldiers of a failed ideology and were leaving with fragments of something freer. And as they boarded trains bound for the coast, some could still hear the echoes, trumpets, laughter, the beat of a world that refused to hate them. That rhythm, born from swing bands and USO halls, had changed the nature of captivity itself. It had turned barbed wire into something porous, a membrane where ideas passed quietly, without permission. The next chapter of this story would show just how deep that change ran. As one extraordinary night brought guards, locals, and prisoners together in the same rhythm, when music, for a few fleeting hours, made the war feel truly over. It was a humid night in July 1945 when everything came together. The fences, the floodlights, the brass instruments, and the last summer of a war almost finished. Camp Concordia, Kansas lay still under a heavy moon, the air thick with the smell of cut wheat and diesel. Inside the sprawling complex, the day's routines had ended. Roll call, work details, the monotonous counting of rations. But tonight there was a murmur in the air, a ripple of anticipation that had nothing to do with orders or inspections. The camp recreation hall, a long wooden structure built for lectures and chaplain services, had been cleared and decorated for a dance. On the outside wall, a sign read USO Night, Live Band. For the troops, the U.S. Army had invited local girls, Red Cross volunteers, and off-duty soldiers from nearby Fort Riley. The event was meant to boost morale as the war's end drew near. What no one planned, at least not officially, was that the music would reach farther than the dance floor. Beyond the floodlights and the chain-link fence, several hundred German prisoners stood quietly. Some leaned against the wire. Others sat on the ground smoking cigarettes. They could hear the faint echo of voices, the laughter of women, and the tuning of instruments. Then, through the darkness, the first trumpet note cut clean through the air, bright, defiant, alive. The sound startled them. It was not the rigid march of a military band, not the cold formality of state music. It was something else entirely, a kind of organized chaos where rhythm and rebellion existed side by side. The American band leader counted off, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the camp exploded with life. Inside the hall, the USO orchestra began with a Glenn Miller classic, In the Mood. Boots tapped. Laughter erupted. The floorboards shook beneath the dancers' steps. For the young GIs, many barely 20, the dance was a brief escape, a reminder that somewhere beyond the killing, life still existed. For the women of Concordia, it was their contribution to victory, their way of bringing joy to tired faces before peace finally returned. But just beyond the wire, another audience listened in stunned silence. The German prisoners, some of whom had been musicians in their own orchestras, felt something shift inside them. The syncopated rhythm, the freedom of improvisation, it defied everything they'd been told about American degeneracy. What they heard was discipline without oppression, joy without arrogance. Then came the moment no one expected. Half an hour into the concert, the American amplifier cut out mid-song. The power line had failed. The hall went dark, the chatter fell silent. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the hum of the Kansas night. Then, from across the fence came the faint sound of a clarinet. It wasn't from the USO band. It was from inside the German compound. A few guards turned toward the sound, unsure whether to shout or smile. The clarinet continued, a soft, cautious melody, and soon it was joined by an accordion, a guitar, a snare drum tapped with improvised sticks. The Germans were playing. They played not the marches of home, but a rough, stumbling swing. It was imperfect but sincere, the kind of imitation born from admiration. The rhythm carried through the night air, across the distance between prisoners and guards. Someone in the USO band laughed, then clapped in time. The crowd joined in. Within minutes, the two bands, one free, one captive, were playing the same song from opposite sides of the wire. No one planned it, and no one stopped it. The melody was Sentimental Journey. The American trumpets found their way back into tune, and the German instruments followed, echoing each phrase. On one side of the fence, women in summer dresses swayed beneath string lights. On the other, men in patched uniforms smiled through disbelief. For a few extraordinary minutes, the war seemed suspended. An officer later wrote in his report, "It was the strangest sight I ever saw. Two enemies divided by a fence, united by rhythm. Not a word was spoken, but every man there understood. The guards didn't intervene. Neither side tried to outplay the other. It was as if the music itself had assumed command. When the power returned, the USO band struck up again, this time with a deliberate nod to the prisoners. The drummer gave a grin toward the wire and hit a rolling intro. The Americans played Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree, and the Germans cheered. Then came applause from both sides, spontaneous, unforced, real. A few prisoners shouted, "Danke," over the fence. A sergeant near the tower answered, "You're welcome." It was forbidden conversation, but nobody cared. That night became a legend within Camp Concordia. In official logs, it was noted only as unusual musical exchange. But among the men who witnessed it, the memory would last a lifetime. For the prisoners, the moment carried a kind of moral vertigo. They had been taught that mercy was weakness, that art was propaganda, and that America was soulless. Yet here they were, being serenaded by an enemy who danced instead of lectured, who laughed instead of scowled, who fought tyranny not only with bombs, but with brass instruments. For the guards and soldiers, the moment was equally disarming. These were the men who had served Hitler, who had destroyed cities and killed allies. And yet, watching them smile through the wire, the Americans saw not monsters but men. The hate that war demanded began to dissolve, replaced by something quieter: respect. The following week, something remarkable happened. A request came from the camp's German orchestra, permission to hold a public concert. The Commandant Colonel Ball approved it. The performance would be attended by American officers, guards, and representatives from the YMCA. The program would include classical selections, Bach and Schubert, but also 2 American songs. On the evening of the concert, the camp theater filled with both audiences. The prisoners wore clean uniforms, pressed and buttoned to the top. The orchestra tuned carefully, their instruments gleaming under low electric lights. When the conductor raised his baton, the first notes of Eine kleine Nachtmusik floated through the hall. Familiar, elegant, safe. Then after a brief pause, the pianist began a swing arrangement of Chattanooga Choo Choo. The guards grinned. The prisoners grinned back. What followed was a full American-style performance, improvised, playful, filled with syncopation and humor. When the piece ended, the applause was thunderous. It was no longer clear who was applauding whom. Afterward, several American officers approached the musicians to congratulate them. One reportedly said, "You've just made the best argument for democracy we could ask for." The remark never made it into official reports, but it captured the essence of what the U.S. had achieved, not through lectures or leaflets, but through the simple power of cultural confidence. Across the country, similar moments were taking shape. At Camp Aliceville, prisoners staged plays and cabaret shows that blended German satire with American humor. At Camp Hearn, a POW band played for a visiting Red Cross delegation, mixing traditional waltzes with swing rhythms. The visitors were astonished by the transformation. Men once loyal to the Reich now whistling American tunes as they marched to work. None of this happened by accident. The Special Projects Division had studied morale as a weapon. They understood that a man whose imagination could move beyond obedience could never again serve tyranny blindly. Re-education, as they called it, wasn't just about ideology. It was about experience, showing, not telling, that freedom worked. Jazz and swing, so despised by the Nazi regime, became tools of rehabilitation. They demonstrated without words that order and liberty could coexist. The summer of 1945 would mark the emotional peak of the POW system in America. In September, Japan surrendered, ending the war entirely. By the year's end, repatriation orders were already being drawn. Camps began to empty, their orchestras disbanding, their newspapers closing down. Yet for many prisoners, those final months of captivity were among the most transformative of their lives. Letters recovered from German archives decades later reveal their astonishment. One former prisoner wrote to his family, "We have learned here what no propaganda could teach, that our enemies have hearts. They fight with strength but live with grace." Another wrote, "When they dance, they do not march. When they play music, they are free." These were not men indoctrinated overnight. They were soldiers who had come face to face with a nation that defeated them through decency. At Camp Concordia, the legacy of that July night endured. The guards talked about it for years. The sound of 2 bands merging across a fence, the sight of German prisoners clapping along to Glenn Miller. When the camp finally closed in 1946, the recreation hall was dismantled, its wood repurposed for local buildings. But the story remained. Years later, in reunions held both in Kansas and in Germany, former prisoners spoke of the moment as something sacred, a flicker of humanity preserved in the chaos of war. Some credited it with changing their lives. A few returned to America after the war as immigrants, drawn back to the land where they first heard jazz. For the guards and townspeople who had once watched the wire shimmer under moonlight, the memory of that night symbolized something larger than victory. It was proof that the principles they fought for, Liberty, fairness, compassion could survive even in places built for enemies. That evening at Camp Concordia was not recorded in any official history of the war. There were no medals, no photographs, no formal recognition. But for those who were there, it was the truest symbol of the American victory, not the triumph of might, but of character. Behind the barbed wire, the defeated discovered that music could erase hierarchy, that rhythm could bridge language, that kindness could outlast ideology. The guards in turn learned that even an enemy could mirror their own longing for peace. The war was almost over, but on that warm night in Kansas, it felt as though humanity had already declared its own ceasefire. And when the last note faded into the prairie air, neither side applauded first. They simply stood silent, smiling, listening to the echo of what they had shared. For in that silence, for the first time, both knew the same truth. The real power of a nation is not measured by the strength of its armies, but by the freedom of its song. When the war finally ended, the fences stayed up for a while longer. Victory in Europe came in May 1945, but for nearly 2 more years, America remained the temporary warden of more than 400,000 German prisoners of war scattered across the continent. From the rolling farmlands of the Midwest to the pine forests of Alabama, the camp still buzzed each morning with roll calls, mess lines, and the faint echo of music drifting through open barracks windows. The guns had fallen silent, yet the human work of ending a war had only begun. Repatriation was not immediate. The Allies faced the monumental task of returning millions of captured soldiers to shattered homelands without infrastructure or transport. For many Germans in American custody, home was a distant concept, a rumor filtered through Red Cross bulletins and radio broadcasts. Their families were scattered, their cities bombed flat, their regime destroyed. The America they had expected to hate had treated them with a dignity their own leaders had denied them. And now, as they prepared to leave, gratitude mingled uneasily with shame. At Camp Concordia, the same site where swing music had once carried across the Kansas plains, prisoners packed their few belongings into crates marked repatriation. The YMCA distributed Bibles and notebooks. The camp orchestra gave its final performance, a program that began with Mozart and ended almost defiantly with an American march. It was their farewell, their way of saying that something of the country that had held them would travel back with them. By 1946, most German POWs in the U.S. were transferred to staging areas in England or France for processing. Others remained to work harvests until labor shortages eased. The War Department allowed prisoners to volunteer for extended service, and thousands did. They had found order, purpose, and respect within an enemy system, an experience so paradoxical that many struggled to explain it later. The cultural imprint. When historians later examined the effects of captivity, they found that the American approach, humane, structured, and infused with cultural exposure, had achieved something remarkable. The United States had managed to turn captivity into a classroom, and civility into its own kind of propaganda. The War Department's Special Projects Division, SPD, compiled reports in 1946 assessing reorientation outcomes. The language was bureaucratic, but between the lines it acknowledged something profound. Through exposure to democratic processes, recreation and literature, a measurable shift in attitude has been observed among POW populations. In plain terms, the program worked. What textbooks and lectures began, music and manners completed. The jazz bands, the camp newspapers, the fair treatment, they did more to dismantle Nazi ideology than any pamphlet ever could. German soldiers who once viewed Americans as decadent came to see them as disciplined, confident, and strangely kind. The democracy they encountered was not theoretical. It was lived in daily interactions, in the way a guard said, "Sir," in the fairness of ration lines, in the willingness to let a defeated enemy play Bach behind the wire. The YMCA and the USO both received commendations for their role in the process. The YMCA's War Prisoners Aid Program had supplied over 36,000 musical instruments and 600,000 books across Allied camps worldwide. The USO, while primarily focused on troop entertainment, had indirectly shaped POW experiences by saturating the American landscape with music and optimism. German prisoners, even in isolation, lived in an echo of that culture. One American officer summarized it succinctly. They came to see that what beat them was not only our army, it was our way of life. The long journey, home for many returning prisoners, home no longer existed as they remembered it. Germany was in ruins. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden burned to skeletal shells. Berlin divided into sectors. Food was scarce, morale even scarcer. The men who had spent years behind American fences returned not as victors, nor entirely as victims, but as witnesses to another world. Their reception was cold. In the early months of repatriation, returning POWs were viewed with suspicion by their own people. Many Germans believed that captivity abroad was a kind of contamination, that those who had survived had somehow betrayed the ideal of loyalty unto death. But the men who had lived under the American flag carried a different memory. They had seen a system that governed without fear. They had experienced freedom in small doses, the ability to form clubs, debate ideas, even improvise music. Over time, these experiences began to ripple through post-war German society. Historians now trace subtle cultural shifts to the return of these former POWs. They were the first generation of Germans to have seen democracy function not as rhetoric, but as daily behavior. Many would later join reconstruction efforts, teaching, engineering, or public administration. Some became outspoken advocates for cooperation with the West, their worldview reshaped by what they had seen across the Atlantic. 1950 study by sociologist Eugen Kogon found that ex-POWs who had been held in the United States were more likely to support democratic institutions than those repatriated from the Eastern Front or Soviet captivity. The American camp, one respondent said, was the first place I ever saw men obey orders because they respected them, not because they feared them. Remembering the music among all the memories that filtered back across the ocean, none resonated as deeply as the sound of music. In memoirs written decades later, former prisoners mentioned not the fences, not the guards, but the concerts. They remembered jazz drifting through the night, swing records spinning on phonographs, and USO shows heard faintly from nearby bases. Some recalled the first time they heard Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy or Chattanooga Choo Choo. They remembered the warmth of clapping hands, the laughter after each number, the feeling that somewhere beyond ideology, joy was still possible. For many, these sounds became symbols of peace. One former soldier, who later became a musician in Munich, wrote, "Jazz taught us that harmony is not uniformity. Every instrument speaks freely, but together they make beauty. That was democracy, and we heard it before we saw it." Bands formed in captivity often continued after the war. A few became semi-professional ensembles in post-war Germany, performing swing and big band music in dance halls across the American occupation zones. Their repertoires included American standards, Tuxedo Junction, Moonlight Serenade, Sentimental Journey. Audiences adored them. The very music once banned as corrupt became the soundtrack of recovery. The Guards' reflections, for the Americans who had guarded the camps, the experience left its own kind of legacy. Many were farmers, teachers, or mechanics before they put on uniforms. They had expected cruelty or hatred or vengeance. Instead, they found discipline, intelligence, and a quiet civility among their captives. Some guards wrote letters home describing the strangeness of it, the sight of German soldiers planting vegetables, painting murals, performing symphonies in captivity. A corporal from Alabama wrote to his wife in 1946, "They fix their uniforms, polish their boots, and then sit down to play Schubert. They're proud men, but they follow rules better than half our recruits. I don't know whether to despise them or admire them." Others admitted that watching their prisoners adapt made them reconsider what victory meant. They had seen firsthand that respect could maintain order more effectively than threats. The War Department quietly incorporated these lessons into its training manuals for future conflicts. The balance of firmness and fairness became doctrine. The transformation of perception. The United States had intended its POW policy as a moral statement, but it became something more. It was an experiment in psychological warfare, one that worked not through fear but through example. The Germans who left those camps carried home a living demonstration that democracy was not chaos but discipline without cruelty. The long-term consequences were subtle but real. In the 1950s, as West Germany aligned with the United States in the emerging Cold War, Many policymakers and cultural leaders were men who had spent time as POWs in America. Their familiarity with American norms, and from jazz to journalism, smoothed the path toward cooperation. The music that once drifted across barbed wire now played on German radios. The American clubs and dances that had seemed foreign became aspirational symbols of modern life. Where once the Nazi regime had equated rhythm with rebellion, the new Germany embraced it as freedom, the human memory of mercy years later. When the men of Camp Concordia and Camp Aliceville reunited, they spoke not of politics but of decency. At a 1980s reunion in Kansas, former guards and prisoners shook hands, shared photographs, and even played together in a small jazz ensemble. One man, a former German trumpet player, looked around the hall and said softly, "This sound saved us." It was not an exaggeration. For men raised under a regime that worshipped strength and silence, to discover that kindness could hold power was revolutionary. The music, the dances, the polite roll calls, all of it revealed that true authority required no shouting. It taught that respect could outlast conquest. Many guards remembered their prisoners with surprising affection. They wrote that the Germans were the best-behaved men we ever had, that their discipline made our job easy. Some even corresponded by mail for decades after the war, bridging the distance that had once been filled by hatred. The camps fade. The lesson remains by 1948. Nearly all German POWs had been repatriated. The camps were dismantled or converted, some into farms, others into schools or warehouses. The fences came down. The barracks rotted in the Kansas sun. What remained were memories and a few artifacts, a clarinet, a camp newspaper, a yellowed program from a prisoner orchestra evening. Today, the site of Camp Concordia is mostly open field. A small museum stands near the original guard tower, its exhibits quiet and dignified. In glass cases lie instruments, sheet music, and photographs of smiling men in prisoner uniforms, holding trumpets and violins. Visitors who walk through that museum feel a peculiar peace. The story it tells is not of battles or blood, but of civility amid catastrophe, a reminder that even in war's darkest shadow, humanity can improvise its own melody, and if one stands still long enough on the windless plains, they might almost hear it, faint, distant, but enduring, the echo of jazz played by enemies who had forgotten. For one night to be enemies at all, the war had reshaped nations, destroyed empires and redrawn borders. Yet within the quiet world of the POW camps, another kind of victory had been won. One fought not with weapons, but with restraint. The Germans left the camps changed. The Americans who guarded them were changed too. Both sides learned that decency could conquer fear more completely than force ever could. And when the last German prisoner stepped aboard the repatriation ship and looked back toward the American shore, perhaps he remembered not the fences or the guards, but the faint sound of a saxophone in the distance. A sound that had once crossed the wire and changed the way he understood freedom. When the war ended, America's guns fell silent, but its music did not. The rhythms that once rolled across the fences of those prison camps never truly stopped. They became something larger, a quiet symbol of who the United States believed itself to be. A nation that could fight ruthlessly when forced, yet treat its captives with civility. A country that wielded not just bombs, but ideas. And among those ideas was the simple conviction that dignity, even for an enemy, must never be surrendered. For the men who had stood behind the wire, that lesson endured. Many returned to Germany carrying only a few belongings, a notebook, a harmonica, perhaps a faded photograph. But in their memories they carried something far greater, the discovery that freedom could sound like laughter, like brass instruments, like the steady rhythm of democracy in motion. For them, jazz was no longer the enemy's noise. It was the sound of forgiveness, the heartbeat of a civilization that had chosen to lead by grace instead of fear. Years later, when those same men raised their own children and rebuilt towns, they taught values born not from victory, but from captivity, tolerance, fairness, self-restraint. The lessons learned in the shadows of barbed wire became the moral foundation of a new Europe, one that sought cooperation over conquest. The fences had vanished, but the music had left its mark. History often remembers wars through their explosions, the thunder of artillery, the flash of fire. But sometimes the quietest notes carry the longest echoes. At Camp Concordia, at Aliceville, at Herne, Those echoes still linger. A saxophone in the night, a guard clapping time, a prisoner smiling through disbelief. It was proof that even in war's darkest hour, humanity could find harmony. That mercy, discipline, and rhythm could coexist. And that perhaps the truest victory of the Second World War was not written in surrender documents, but in a shared song, the one that crossed the wire, silenced hatred, and reminded the world that freedom, at its purest, has always been played in time with compassion,